Welcome to Revolution Health. This is Dr. Jason Dean. We are back, and I'm here with just an amazing lady. She's a genius, and I've had her on the show a couple times before a while ago, but I wanted to cover some things with her, get some updates on her, and actually talk about something that I don't think a lot of people know, because I dive in the world of minerals a lot. I also speak with Morley Robbins. We talk about minerals, and so I wanted to cover something with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. But first of all, Dr. Seneff, welcome back to the show. Thanks for being on.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Absolutely. And you are always learning something new. You are all over the internet doing tons of interviews and giving great information. So I appreciate you being back on. And the first thing I wanted to do before I got my questions in was check with any updates with you, because, as we talked before, you said you're always learning new things, but give us any updates in the world of what you're dealing with right now.
Yeah, well, I'm just fascinated with, of course, the idea of glyphosate substituting for glycine during protein synthesis. That really keeps me awake at night. And it's so cool. I mean, the science is just unbelievable. And I keep getting new information, keep finding new resources. I've found a great resource on the web. I found a paper, and the paper pointed to a link where they had a service where you could put a peptide sequence into the page and click go, and it would show you matches to certain profiles of amino acid distributions that would bind to ATP, ADP, all these phosphorylated, very important molecules in biology. So you could find all these motifs where phosphate binds, and you could find the place where phosphate binds, and you could confirm in some cases that it's glycine. So basically, I'm looking at glyphosate disrupting phosphate binding of all proteins that bind phosphate, where glycine is the place where the phosphate binds. So it's very, very specific, but it has enormous consequences. And it's a good example is myosin, which is the muscle protein. And I've seen that myosin, I believe myosin gets disrupted by glyphosate. I believe that's why we have issues with the gut. One of the reasons that's happening in the gut is a paralysis, because the myosin is getting broken by the glyphosate. And this, I think, is happening in autism. Wow. And it's a characteristic feature of the autistic gut in many cases that their gut is basically paralyzed. And it's also been shown with a woman who tried to poison herself with glyphosate that her gut got paralyzed. So I think that sort of fits with the myosin. It fits with some other proteins too that are very interesting. Like there's one called rubisco, a really fun protein, probably the most common protein in the world. And it's produced by plants. And rubisco is involved in the incorporation of carbon into organic matter. So inorganic carbon into organic matter. Rubisco has been shown to be suppressed by glyphosate in papers. And rubisco also has this issue of phosphate binding. So I'm starting to see a pattern where the proteins that are known to be affected by glyphosate, or that's suspected to be affected because of the evidence we see, have this property of glycine binding to phosphate. And the reason why glyphosate disrupts it is because glyphosate fits where the phosphate should go. The methylphosphonyl group of glyphosate gets in the way. It goes into the protein, gets in the way of the phosphate. So the phosphate can't bind. And that messes up the protein's function. So I don't know if that's too hard for people to understand, but it's really, really wild.
No, and I'd like to add too is one of the things that makes me think about, and this was kind of, I don't know if I got this from you, if I learned it from someone else, but then you popped my mind, was we're getting to a point where, because you're dealing with amino acids, you're dealing with proteins, we're getting to the point where our bodies are becoming glyphosate bodies, because we're trying to build proteins up in our own bodies. So if that glycine molecule and the whole biochemistry you just talked about is working the way it is, our tissues are literally becoming glyphosate tissues. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. I think so. I think it's getting all over our tissues. It's especially worrisome when it gets into the brain. I think it's causing Alzheimer's disease, which is going up exactly in step with glyphosate usage on core crops. Perfect match. Very terrifying. And I'm really interested in Alzheimer's, and I've advanced my understanding there as well. And it's just like autism, actually. There's like many different threads. Alzheimer's is a very complicated disease. There's been a ton of papers written. There's all these different things that go wrong. And I'm taking them one by one and figuring out how glyphosate would cause that. The same thing with autism. It all fits. I mean, it beautifully fits. And so it's a challenge to write it up. I'm actually working on a book on glyphosate. I'm under contract with Chelsea Green. I'm looking forward to getting it out, although it's the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life, because I'm trying to make it accessible to people who are maybe the smart general public, or the educated general public, or the interested general public. as much as possible, because it's not easy stuff, but I'm trying to make it as accessible as possible while talking about these things that I'm finding, because I can't leave them out. They're like so amazing. They're so special.
I could imagine. Now, a question for you too, and this just popped in my mind to ask is, we obviously have a very bad factory farming issue going on with cattle and everything else, and it's not good to eat that. And you even said previous, which I totally agree with, that we basically have to go 100% organic here to even have a chance from a food standpoint. How glyphosate toxic, if you don't, no problem, but you probably can speculate on it.
Yeah.
How glyphosate toxic is our cattle, whether it's grass-fed or even factory farmed?
I know. I mean, even grass-fed, you've got to worry because and these days they have glyphosate-resistant grass, which is really, like alfalfa, and that the cows could be eating. I mean, that's also terrifying. You want to believe that if you eat grass-fed beef, it's going to be good. And we love grass-fed beef. I think it's a very healthy food, but of course there is this issue, and we don't know how much. Certainly with the CAFO cows, I think you can pretty much guarantee, if I'm right about substituting for glycine, there's going to be glyphosate in the collagen, because the collagen is loaded with glycine. Every third amino acid is a glycine in this pattern of GXY, GXY, GXY. Collagen has a tremendous opportunity for glyphosate substitution. And I think that's why we have an epidemic in opioid drug abuse, because we've got so many people with sore backs, aching, joints, knee surgery and hip surgery and foot problems and shoulder problems. I mean, neck problems. All these issues we're having with our joints, I think, are directly connected to glyphosate substituting for glycine in collagen, also in keratin. Both of those are critical for our structure of our body, and they're getting disturbed by the glyphosate in a big way, I suspect. Again, it's all theory. I mean, I really want someone to do the research to prove it. And as I have said to you in the past, Monsanto has gone a good ways towards proving it already in their own studies, which are not published, but Anthony Samsel has access to them. And we've written about them in our papers. There's very good evidence from Monsanto studies that this is happening, I believe. In terms of having glyphosate in the tissues that you can't detect, you have radioactive label that shows you it's there. You run it through proteolysis, which breaks the proteins down into individual amino acids, and voila, there's the glyphosate. So they admitted perhaps it's being incorporated into the protein. That was their words, not mine.
Absolutely.
In the paper. So it just seems to me like the Monsanto researchers, I believe, understand this is happening, and they know that it's game over if people find out. That's why they're working so hard to make sure people know that what I'm saying is not possible.
Yeah, I think you're being humble by saying it's just theory. I think you're onto it. I think you're onto it. And obviously, I think other people have started saying some similar things too. And from a collagen standpoint, again, we're talking about a protein. It has to build up to a protein that the glyphosate is in there. But the other interesting thing is I just the other day went and bought organic collagen to try it, because I've never really had it. I was curious to taste. But at the same time, it's a booming market right now in the natural health world, is getting collagen, putting it in your coffee, putting in different things. We obviously hope that that's clean,
right?
But we don't know, and I'm sure there's a lot of inferior collagens out there in the market, but does it have glyphosate in it? And then we obviously worry about what that builds up into our body, and it becomes a real problem at that point, because now we're marketing it at that point. We don't even realize we're marketing it. So that's a massive issue.
Absolutely. And I think there's so many studies out there on different food types, different things about sugar's bad for you, or fats are bad for you, or they're good for you. They're, all this confusion. I think if you looked at all those studies in retrospect, and you could say which ones were sourced from glyphosate riddled foods versus not, that you'd see that was almost the whole story. Whether there was glyphosate in the food, that was what caused it to be toxic. Game story over. It's like, I really think the glyphosate is a major contributor to the apparent health or non-health of a particular food, is whether it's got glyphosate in it.
That makes 100%. It completely is real. And the other thing too is I think we're getting to a point, as a physician, we take a lot of different tests. There's a lot of different diagnostic tests you can take, but at this point now, there's actually tests coming out that are testing just for glyphosate in the body, and so many people are testing for it. I almost wonder if it has to become across the board, whether it's medical doctors, any physician at this point. We need inexpensive glyphosate tests.
I know.
If you're not handling the glyphosate in the body, you're not detoxing that out. We have big problems.
Right. And I know people who are trying to develop more efficient, cheaper ways to test for glyphosate. I think that the industries are going to recognize an opportunity here. The chemists, the people who can do this sort of thing are going to recognize an opportunity if they can come up with a way to test for glyphosate that's economical. That's going to be a game changer, because a lot of people it's frustrating to spend that money. And of course, if you're looking at your urine, it's only a 2-week sample, the last 2 weeks. So you don't learn much, if you come out negative, well, maybe I ate organic over the last 2 weeks, but maybe before that I didn't, you can do a hair test. Hair tests are coming out now that can capture the last 3 months. So that's a slight improvement. But and then of course you've also got it all over your body that you can't test. It's in your joints. It's in your brain. I mean, it's everywhere, and you can't test that.
I always tell people I hate being the one that's doom and gloom. And it's not that we're being doom and gloom. It's more that I think to solve the problems in healthcare, you have to know where the problem is. And so many people still aren't awake to this. And so you have to wake them up to it so they know this is actually happening. And I want to change gears a little bit, because I wanted a couple of questions I wanted to ask you that we talked about before. Is I've been diving a lot into detox channels. And it's funny, my friend Morley Robbins just jumped in, and he totally gets the glyphosate thing, but we're also been talking about the copper metabolism as well, because iron is becoming so toxic. Copper is necessary. That dives into the liver itself in a detox pathway. How clogged up is the liver getting at this point with glyphosate? And then I know sulfur, you talk about sulfur a lot.
Oh, the minerals are all messed up with glyphosate. I'm convinced the manganese, the copper, the zinc, the iron, they all become simultaneously deficient and toxic at the same time. It's really quite remarkable. In fact, there's studies that show zinc. There are studies on mice where they show that zinc supplementation can actually help protect them from glyphosate toxicity. Some interesting studies where they show that glyphosate was toxic to the liver, but if they gave them zinc beforehand, the zinc could help to offset the glyphosate toxicity. And actually what happens, I think, is that the zinc gets the liver really soaks up zinc when it's toxic. It needs the zinc to detox. There's metallothionein, I think it's called. There's a zinc-based protein that's a really good antioxidant that gets beefed up in the liver when it's responding to toxic exposures. And the liver will even deprive the rest of the body of zinc in order to get enough to deal with that. So you'll end up with a zinc deficiency in the blood because the liver's hogging the zinc in order to protect itself from the toxic element. That's one thing. Sulfur is an absolute mess with glyphosate. I've studied that deeply. I think it's messing up sulfite oxidase in the gut, which is causing a lot of problems because sulfite is very toxic. Sulfate is essential, and you're blocked in the ability to oxidize sulfite to sulfate. A lot of people end up with an overgrowth of desulfovibrio or Bilophila wadsworthia. These are two microbes that reduce sulfite to hydrogen sulfide gas. Then you get excess hydrogen sulfide gas in your gut, and that causes bloating and discomfort and even toxicity. It can even migrate. Hydrogen sulfide can move all over your body, get into your brain, and cause brain fog. So you can get all these consequences from too much hydrogen sulfide because you can't get the sulfite to sulfate, so you take it down to hydrogen sulfide, which is less toxic than sulfite, but still, and it's useful in small amounts. I mean, a lot of these things, all the minerals are like that. They're useful at the appropriate levels and if they can be safely transported, but they're toxic if they're sort of not properly controlled. And glyphosate causes them to be not properly controlled.
Interesting. It's so fascinating. I almost wonder too if there's just been this trend in the last several years that we're talking about. Well, someone's not methylating properly, and their methylation is broken. Well, is their methylation really genetically broken, or has their methylation been stopped by this assault on the body and assault on the liver?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's one of the things too. In fact, methyls are derived from glycine in the gut. Glycine is a source of methyl groups. And I've looked into the enzymes in that pathway. Of course, also glyphosate could simply be substituting for glycine at the input because it's a glycine analog. It could outcompete the glycine in binding to the enzyme and not allow the glycine to get converted to the methyl groups. And it could also be disrupting the enzymes because some of them have critical glycine dependencies. So when you look at all these, I mean, it's quite a job to look at all the enzymes and find out if they have essential glycines, number one. And number two, if they're in an appropriate environment where the glyphosate is going to substitute. So I've learned my rules of glyphosate substitution, and it's kind of interesting and complicated, but it's fun because you just go look up the amino acid sequence of a protein. You can find the place where, okay, that looks like it would be susceptible. Then you dig the literature to find out what that piece of the protein does, if anything, whether it's highly conserved. It's a whole giant puzzle that you work out to determine that a particular protein looks like it could be susceptible to glyphosate contamination. And then you can sort of go and see if glyphosate causes trouble for that protein in the literature. That's the game I'm playing with all these different proteins. So I'm developing a list of proteins that are likely to be affected. Sulfide oxidase is definitely on that list, as well as I said, the myosin and various proteins that bind ATP, various reducing proteins. There's a whole bunch of proteins that maintain glutathione and vitamin C in their reduced form. Glutathione and vitamin C are really important antioxidants in the liver, but they need to be reduced in order to be effective. And there are proteins they're enzymes whose job is to keep them reduced. They keep taking away they get oxidized in response to the oxidizing agents, and then they protect other proteins from damage by doing so. But then there's active bring them back to their initial state so they can do it again step that is going to get disrupted by glyphosate if I'm right about my rules for when glyphosate would disrupt proteins, because all of the proteins that maintain those things in the reduced state are going to be affected by glyphosate.
Wow. Now, the other thing that I've seen personally, I'm sure others have seen it as well, is a rise in fatty liver.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
But from people that don't drink at all.
Yes,
now,
non-alcoholic.
Do you connect that to glyphosate and other toxins?
I've already written the section in my book that deals with that. So
I didn't know she was going to say that. That was just an honest question.
That's great. Yeah, it's really fascinating. I've been noticing non-alcoholic fatty liver disease going up for quite some time. And of course, it leads to eventually to steatohepatitis, which is like hardening of the liver, and then you can get liver cancer as well, if it progresses further to liver cancer. So it's a very serious problem. And it's interesting because I think it has to do mainly with the disruption of fructose metabolism, because fructose comes into the gut. And we've got people who are talking about, fructose is toxic. People like Lustig, they've been saying fructose is really bad, which is ridiculous because fructose is in fruit, and fruit ought to be a healthy food, It doesn't make sense that fructose is toxic. It really doesn't make sense. But what's happening is that the pathways that metabolize fructose to other things in the gut, often by the gut microbes, are being disrupted by glyphosate. And I can name two, and they both have to do with phosphoenolpyruvate, which again is a phospho. That's whenever you see phosphate, you've got to worry about possibilities of glyphosate disrupting it. And phosphoenolpyruvate is a precursor to in the pathway that glyphosate famously disrupts in the gut microbes, which is the EPSP synthase in the shikimate pathway. And PEP is made from fructose. So what happens is PEP piles up, and then fructose piles up because you block the conversion of fructose to PEP if you can't take it further into these other metabolites. And the same thing happens along another pathway with PEP carboxylase that also gets blocked for the same reason, I suspect. And it's a glycine substitution for sure. The proteins have the glycine in the right place where the phosphate binds. It's absolutely perfect match for both of them. So the fructose piles up because it can't go through these pathways. Then it hits the liver, and the liver's like, oh my gosh, I can't let this fructose get into the general circulation because it's very glycating. Fructose is 10 times as bad as glucose as a glycating agent. And that's the hemoglobin A1C, the diabetes thing, the high blood sugar. So the liver is very responsible about getting all the bad stuff out of the blood as it comes in on the hepatic portal vein. It sees this fructose, it grabs it up, and the liver's only choice is to convert it into fat. It doesn't know what to do with the fructose. It converts it into fat, and then it's like, oh, I've got to store this fat. And this is where the liver also needs cholesterol to do that. It can't store fat without cholesterol. So it makes these fatty deposits in the liver, fat and cholesterol. It also ships out a whole bunch of LDL particles to help get rid of the fructose. So the fructose is going to drive up your serum LDL, which is the quote unquote bad guy in heart disease. And we also have serum LDL is also going up in the general population in step with the rise in glyphosate usage. I looked into that with respect to hospital discharge data. They showed a rising number of patients reporting high serum LDL at exit from the hospital, more specifically, matching with the rising in glyphosate usage. And I think it's being driven by the fructose. The fructose has to be shipped out as LDL particles once it's turned into fat, or it's stored locally as fatty liver disease. And also because the bile acids are blocked also, so you can't ship it out through the bile acids, the bile acids are getting blocked as well. So
it's a whole different viewpoint on the cholesterol, the liver in general. It's fascinating. And we now, I mean, glyphosate, so at this point it's technically an antibiotic. It's also a chelator. So it's chelating the minerals out of the entire body, and it's rendering the liver, I mean, essentially not useless, but it's draining it.
It really is. And of course, it's also the CYP enzymes, the cytochrome P450 enzymes that are disrupted by glyphosate. That's been shown very clearly in mouse studies. And also the sulfate. Sulfation is a major way to detoxify a lot of things, all these toxic phenols and whatnot, the various metabolites of some of the gut microbes that are phenolic compounds are detoxed by adding sulfate. Even some of the other chemicals are detoxed by adding, including mercury, by the way. Mercury is detoxed by adding sulfate in the liver. And that addition of sulfate is almost certainly, according to my rules of my game, almost certainly disrupted by glyphosate. First of all, the supply of sulfate because of the sulfite oxidase, but also the activated sulfate molecule is called PAPS, and it's an interesting molecule. It starts with an ATP molecule. That's triphosphates. So that's 3 phosphates to worry about. And then it kicks off the 2 of those phosphates and puts a sulfate there instead. And then it picks up another phosphate from another ATP molecule. So there's 2 ATP molecules binding to this enzyme that makes the PEP. And both of those binding sites have vulnerabilities to glyphosate substitution, messing them up. So you can't make the activated sulfate, which means you can't add sulfate to things, which means you can't detox things that are not water soluble.
So it's not only detox, plus sulfur is necessary for the brain. That's correct, right?
Absolutely. Sulfate is really, really essential in the brain. And heparan sulfate in particular, a really, really interesting molecule. I've studied it deeply. Many studies on autistic kids and on autistic mice. Multiple different kinds of autistic mice have all shown heparan sulfate deficiency in the cerebrospinal fluid, in the ventricles, in the brain ventricles. Really, really interesting, because that heparan sulfate is essential for the development of the migration and the maturation of the neurons that come out of these precursor cells in that locale. It's really, really interesting. That whole process of the maturation of the brain is going to get messed up if the heparan sulfate is deficient, which is showing up in autism.
Wow. And it's interesting. I'll give you a clinical picture of actually myself, and you can tell me what happened physiologically, but I didn't know what happened until a couple of days ago when I realized I went a little more carnivore, not fully carnivore, keto diet. But then what I did was I started mega dosing on whole food, basically B complex, but made from bovine liver, and then actual liver as well.
Oh, you ate a lot of liver.
Yeah, it's through supplementation, whole food supplementation, as well as actually going to be eating liver. And literally 2 things that happened. One, I lost a little bit of weight. I didn't need to lose a lot of weight, but I lost what I kind of had gained a little. You hit your 40 and you put on a little bit. But the other 2 things that happened was my cravings for coffee completely disappeared, gone. Like I don't need any, but also my brain felt like it turned on for the first time, and I didn't even know it wasn't turned on. Literally just went clarity thinking, energy, and the nervous system totally relaxed. And that was only after putting in quality liver and just the food, and obviously minerals and things like that. But I wonder myself, being very active all day long, and there's a lot of people who aren't as active as what we are, and how their brains are probably turned off. Combination of glyphosate, not enough sulfur, etc., but kind of a clinical picture of how that could occur.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I mean, it's really sad because the organ meats are very, very healthy normally, and we used to eat them routinely. I remember when I was a child, we were being encouraged by the government to eat liver once a week, and none of us particularly liked it. And my mom would try to serve it, and we'd sort of grumble about it. But it was liver once a week was kind of encouraged in those days. They really thought liver was a healthy choice. Now they won't even sell liver. I suspect it looks so horrible that it wouldn't sell anyway, because they're probably all fatty liver. It's probably, I don't know, the liver of the cows is probably a total mess at this point, and it would not be very appetizing. So you have to be very careful to buy a liver that's been living in an animal that was doing very well with a little exposure to toxic chemicals, because the liver, of course, it has tremendous nutritional value, but it also accumulates toxins. So it has to be the liver of an animal that lived a really healthy, happy life, which is hard to find. So,
no, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. They promoted eating liver when you were growing up.
Yes, it was supposed to be something we should try to eat.
Wow. And obviously, yeah, everyone has kind of turned their, I looked at the liver, which I'll probably end up eating just because I want to try it. But at the same time, I looked at it, my pill form looks a lot better than actual eating it, because it doesn't taste that great, but it is so healthy if you get the proper form.
I like chicken liver, and we can get organic chicken liver, which we have periodically.
Wow, that's fascinating. Now, you have a book you're writing.
Yes.
Is there any sneak peek you can give us that before we head out today?
Well, it's on glyphosate, so it's going to be all about glyphosate, and there's going to be a lot of it about the protein substitution and the whole thing that I worked out with respect to the way the rules of the game. In terms of, it's really quite fascinating. I feel like it's almost like a detective story, if I can do it right, to just sort of uncover the science and then start to look for other patterns that match, and then to fold in new diseases. So it's a very big challenge to, as I said, to write it at a level that's accessible to people who don't have a lot of background, at the same time sort of preserving the core message of the mechanism of toxicity with glyphosate, which is so fascinating to me. And then the sort of, and of course, a lot about sulfur, the whole sulfur, how it's handled in the body, and the importance of sulfate and the heparin sulfate, all of that as well. So it's kind of it's certainly a scientific book. I'm focusing more on the science. I'll get into a little bit of the politics, and of course, also the last chapter will be on solutions. So, and I'm learning more and more about solutions. Quite interesting. In fact, I'm learning some new things about some of the things that have been promoted as being helpful. In particular, fulvic acid and humic acid. People are recommending those as healthy supplements to take, and that's complicated molecules that are organic matter from the soil, and again, you have to make sure it's sourced from very healthy soil, which is hard to find. But it's interesting. I found a paper that talked about enzymes that bind to those fulvic acid and humic acid, and that some of those enzymes can actually break down glyphosate. So very, very interesting. So I feel like the foods that are going to be, or the supplements that are going to be really, really useful, are going to be things that break down glyphosate.
I would agree. Yeah, absolutely. It's such a problem. I mean, it's showing up everywhere, and I know healthy people that were presumably very healthy, and they had the test taken, and they found themselves far more toxic than they thought.
Yeah, I know. It's really hard to avoid. I mean, even eating organic is often not good enough to avoid it, because it's all over the place. It's in the water, it's in the air, it's in the cotton clothing, it's in the tampons. It's just very, very difficult to avoid. So
it's rough. Now, real quick before we go, have you been contacted for any into this input into the? I know Monsanto's being sued constantly now, and they lost the lawsuit. Technically, I think it went to appeal, but they're losing. I mean, they're even having problems behind the scenes. The CEO got knocked off a little bit, and they're having trouble. Have they come to your research at all, or are they staying totally away from what you're doing?
The lawyers have contacted me, and I've provided them with information. I typically am a behind-the-scenes researcher who helps supply them with papers that talk about certain things that can be useful to them. So, yes, but I've not been. I don't think they would call me up as a witness, because I'm too controversial. That's okay with me too, because I'm not sure I could handle the heat. I'm sure they would really try very hard to make sure everybody knew that I'm a lunatic or something. So it wouldn't be pleasant.
You're a lunatic. You're a good lunatic. You're one of us. You're preaching the truth, and not everyone can handle that. And that's just what's happening. That's why you're so popular, because when you hear the truth, it resonates and it makes sense. And what you're saying, it makes complete sense. So I appreciate you being on the show again, ma'am. It's a pleasure. It's been a long time, but you're so great.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And then, Dr. Seneff, where can people contact you or reach out to you if they have any questions or they're interested in something you're doing?
Well, they can. My webpage at MIT is a little complicated, but it's people.csail, CSAIL. That's my lab, Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory. .mit.edu/Seneff, my last name, SENEFF. And my email address is there too, if you want to send me email. That's the best way to reach me, is through email.
I would love for you to drop that link there too at the end if you see this, or not, or send it over to me. I'll put the link down there.
I'll do that.
People will be very fascinated. I've seen the page. It's phenomenal. It's very basic, but
I haven't tried to make it fluffy and fancy.
No, but it's packed with information. So
right.
Beautiful, ma'am. Thank you so much for bringing everybody knowledge today on some more information and some of the questions I had as well. So I appreciate you always, and keep doing amazing work.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Rose and Health. This is Dr. Jason Dean with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. If you have any questions, put them down below. We'll answer the best we can, and share this around so we can educate more people on what is going on with health and how we can help them. You guys have an amazing day. Signing off. Take care of yourself and be healthy.
Bye-bye.